What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So under normal circumstances, we use Thursday as our day to do like the rundown. Hey, here's a really good story that I enjoyed and I think you guys will enjoy it too, and that kind of crazy thing. But we're actually gonna go ahead and blow that off today just because it's not nearly as interesting as this. In this video, we are going to be running over the origin of adamantium, specifically the origin of the adamantium that is bonded to the skeleton of Wolverine and bonded to the claws of X-23, because as we'll talk about in our origin story tomorrow, X-23's entire skeleton is not bonded with adamantium, just the claws. Now, this is going to seem like it kind of comes out of left field, but bear with me for a second because within the span of 4 minutes, it's all going to make perfect sense. So, the origin of adamantium really kind of like winds back to the earliest days of humanity, right? With this sentient bacteria called Sublime. And Sublime was this organism that basically thrived by jumping from one host to the next, but Sublime learned pretty fast that when it jumped to a host, it could basically dominate the will of that host. It could control it. That's one of the reasons why in my video on a history of the Marvel Universe, the Elder Gods basically waged war against one another because they were all under the influence of Sublime. But the idea here was that during this time, Sublime was basically the dominant species on the planet Earth. There was no organism that existed on Earth that could resist the will of Sublime. Now, fast forward to about 15,000 years before the modern day. During this time, the planet Earth was one of a multitude of planets across the universe that were visited by the Celestials, and the Celestials had basically manipulated the genes of the planet Earth to create 3 groups: Eternals, Deviants, and then a 3rd group. We don't need to worry about Eternals and Deviants for this video, but the 3rd group basically had their genes modified in such a way that they went forward appearing to be normal, but the genes were adjusted so that in some 15,000 years, there would be this huge explosion of mutants across the planet Earth. What also happened is the genes were modified so that if a person was exposed to some weird kind of situation, for example, they were blasted with cosmic radiation, instead of mutating into some horrendous form, they would suddenly develop powers. Hence the reason why Peter Parker became Spider-Man, why Steve Rogers became Captain America, why the Fantastic Four became the Fantastic Four. Now, between 15,000 years ago and right now, mutants began popping up periodically. Like it would be a mutant would be born here, and then 3,000 years later, another mutant would be born, and then 5,000 years after that, another mutant would be born. The first of these was a character named Selene. Selene basically had to kind of feed off the energy, feed off the life force of individuals in order to keep herself alive. There were others who were born like Apocalypse, Gideon, there were others like Burke and Chandra, but these were basically what were called externals, meaning they are inherently immortal mutants, so that if they were to die, if they were to be shot in the head or something along those lines, their spiritual essences would basically live on. Now that's assuming you could destroy their physical bodies. For the most part, they were impervious to like normal weapons. You'd have to do something extreme, like the Incredible Hulk would have to rip their head off or something along those lines. But if their physical bodies were destroyed, then they would basically live on in a spiritual essence, and then they would take over another host body, or their physical body would reconstitute itself by way of like a healing factor or something along those lines. But jumping to the 1800s or so, there was a guy in London by the name of Nathaniel Essex. And Nathaniel Essex was this guy who was obsessed with human biology. He knew that there were mutants that were living among them. The mutants didn't know what they were. These externals had no idea what they were, but Nathaniel Essex believed that they were mutations, and they were basically harbingers of a not too far-flung future when human beings would begin to disappear and would basically move out of the way for these mutants to rise to prominence. Nathaniel Essex hypothesized that mutants would have a wide array of different powers, everything from telepathy and telekinesis to the ability to warp reality on a universal scale. The problem with this is that Nathaniel Essex's colleagues considered him to be crazy. They kicked him out of the Royal Academy of Sciences, all that kind of good stuff. Now, eventually, Nathaniel Essex is met by Apocalypse, and Apocalypse, is intrigued by what Nathaniel Essex is doing and says, "Hearken, alas, I will give you immortality if you will continue your studies and basically keep me abreast of what it is that you're doing." And so Nathaniel Essex was modified by the technology of Apocalypse and went forward as Mr. Sinister. Now, skip past all this and let's jump to the outbreak of World War II. We're kind of doing a whole lot of, jumps here and there, but we're jumping to the outbreak of World War II. With Sublime sitting down and realizing that the more mutants there were popping up, the more his dominance of the planet Earth was being challenged, Sublime basically came to the conclusion that a fighting force needed to be created for the purpose of eliminating mutants in their entirety. And so what John Sublime did is create a program called Weapons Plus. And Weapons Plus was basically going to be the first step. It was going to be this umbrella company that was designed for the purpose of just finding different ways to create super soldiers and different things like that. Now, at the same time that this was happening, Mr. Sinister, Nathaniel Essex, had taken up residence in the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he was basically experimenting on prisoners that were taken by the Nazis during World War II. He was conducting all kinds of experiments, where he was analyzing the genes of normal humans, he was analyzing the genes of mutants who were captured, and he was trying to figure out what causes humans to turn into mutants, what this X gene is, trying to discover this stuff. Of course, he documented all of his work in a journal, but the issue was that on the American front, back in the United States, John Sublime was still looking for a way to create super soldiers. And so word had reached the ears of Sublime that a German scientist named Abraham Erskine had developed a serum that could create super soldiers. And so what John Sublime did was have Sergeant Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos basically, travel into Germany, extract Abraham Erskine, and bring him to the United States. Now, John Sublime never interacted with Erskine. Erskine never knew who John Sublime was. All Erskine knew was that he was basically working for the US government to create super soldiers. And so after going through a whole list of candidates, eventually Abraham Erskine settled on Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers went through the super soldier program and he became Captain America. The issue is that in the eyes of Sublime, Captain America was a complete and total failure. And the reason why was because Captain America was supposed to be the first in a line of super soldiers that would basically serve the ultimate purpose of killing off mutants across the planet Earth. But because of Captain America's moral code and that he didn't kill, he didn't torture, John Sublime considered him to be a failure. And so because of this, and because Abraham Erskine had been killed by the Nazis, no one was able to duplicate the super soldier serum, which John Sublime intended to do, to basically duplicate the serum and then go back to the drawing board, creating like a conditioning program that would make a new Steve Rogers, but who would basically function under the direction of John Sublime without any measure of a moral compass. And so what Sublime did, realizing the serum couldn't be duplicated, is he basically sent one of his guys to begin looking around for ways to kind of advance and keep the super soldier program going. Now, while these guys were hunting around for the super soldier serum, Captain America was off just being a hero, right? I mean, those are the old Captain America stories where he was fighting against, all the forces of Hydra and the Nazis and so on and so forth. But his journeys eventually took him to Wakanda. And the reason why was because of the fact that, remember, Wakanda holds vibranium. And Adolf Hitler, Red Skull, Baron von Strucker, a handful of others had come to the realization that if Nazi Germany had Wakanda's vibranium, the weapons they could create would make them virtually indestructible. And so when they went to invade Wakanda, the United States responded, particularly Captain America, Bucky Barnes, Namor the Submariner, and Jim Hammond, the original Human Torch, operating as the superhero group The Invaders. They helped to fight off the Hydra and Nazi soldiers, and the result was that Captain America basically received a few things for his work. The first is that he came to the realization that the Wakandan soldiers were using round shields instead of the iron-shaped shield that he had. And so Captain America said, well, I mean, they're more aerodynamic, they can be used offensively and defensively. And so because of that, Captain America, after receiving a shard of vibranium as thanks from the King of Wakanda at the time, went back to the United States and told the government that he wanted a new shield that was going to be round. Enter a guy by the name of Myron McLean. Myron McLean was a metallurgist that worked for the US government. And what the US government did is they said, Captain America wants a new shield composed of this material called vibranium, make the shield for him. And so Myron McLean began the process of building this shield. The issue was that he literally fell asleep while he was making it. And when he woke up, he discovered that some unknown compounds had mixed with the vibranium, and the result was that he basically came across this indestructible shield. Now, we know now in Marvel Comics that the materials were basically iron and steel, but at the time, Myron McLean didn't know that. And so the result was that Myron McLean tried to find a way to recreate Captain America's shield, and in doing so, accidentally stumbled across adamantium. Now, with regards to the whole aspect of Wolverine getting involved into the fray, while this shield was being made and adamantium was being discovered and so on and so forth, the guys that were basically working for John Sublime had stumbled across the journals of Mr. Sinister within Auschwitz after the concentration camp had been liberated by Captain America, Bucky Barnes, and so on. They took the journals back to John Sublime and Weapons Plus, and they began creating more weapons programs, weapons 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Using the information in Mr. Sinister's journal, these weapons projects included everything ranging from bonding animals with cybernetic implants to giving people pills that would send them into a frenzy and, increase their strength and speed, so on and so forth, but none of them came anywhere close to duplicating Captain America's super soldier serum. And so because of this, Weapons Plus began to shift its focus. And so in the early 1960s, when Spider-Man was first popping up, when Peter Parker was being bitten by a radioactive spider, when the Fantastic Four were going into space, being blasted with cosmic rays, when Tony Stark was being taken prisoner in Vietnam, and building the Iron Man suit, there was a group that was operating as a joint venture between the United States' CIA and Canada's clandestine organization, Department K. This group was called Team X, and they basically carried out Black Ops missions. What would happen is the CIA would use Team X operating out of Canada to send them on various missions as a buffer. And what this means is that if Team X were to fail, if they were to be caught, then basically the CIA could devolve itself. They could walk away and they could say, well, look, we had nothing to do with that. That was all Canada's Department K. But word had reached the ears of John Sublime that one of the members of Team X was was basically healing from every single injury that he had. Of course, this person being Logan. And because of this, with Team X basically being part of the CIA, the team was absorbed by Weapons Plus, and the various individuals that were part of the team were brought in as part of the new Weapons 10 or Weapon X project. And so what happened is Wolverine was basically forced into the adamantium bonding process. Because of his healing factor, the bonding process was successful. The issue is that, as we know, almost immediately after this bonding process was completed, he basically broke out of his containment pod or whatever it is, using the various trainings and the fact that he was very much in a state of animal madness. He essentially killed everybody who was there and then took off. Of course, this leads into the origin of X-23, but I hope this made sense to you guys. I thought it was a pretty cool topic to kind of talk about, the origin of Wolverine's adamantium, more or less. But yeah, it's a really interesting set of events because there's so many things that go into this, so many aspects that sort of lead up to this thing. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.